Let's go home.
The Bond franchise under Daniel Craig has more or less come to a close. The man himself, the highest paid actor to play the role, has turned down a $100 million offer to return for 2 more films, saying that he'd rather slash his wrists than be James Bond again. Now, this isn't necessarily confirmation that he won't return for 1 more, since he's made and broken similar statements before, and that the offer referenced was about the prospect of filming 2 movies back-to-back as soon as possible. Nevertheless, it seems like a good time to talk about the possible directions that the franchise could take under the next actor to assume the role. It might be helpful to think about this in terms of how the Daniel Craig Bond started off, as a response to the previous iteration. In my view, the next Bond film should be made while mindful of the cinematic landscape of the spy films of its day, much like Casino Royale was. Unlike Casino Royale, though, the next Bond film isn't following the disaster that was Die Another Day. That movie was bad and campy, which gave the next director the easiest job in the world. All you have to do is turn all the wheels in the opposite direction. But where do you go when you're left with a movie like Spectre, that was not the worst Bond movie, and that had a tone that didn't fully embrace realism or camp? And more importantly, where do you go when you already have movies that have made these ideas work, like Kingsman: The Secret Service, or Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation, or Man from U.N.C.L.E.? How do you distinguish yourself from these movies? If we're going to proceed as tradition would have it, the solution is you don't. You just rely on the brand. Bond movies usually function as a time capsule for the action movies of the period, which explains why there's a Bond movie out there that's a blaxploitation film, another one that tried to be a Star Wars film, and one that's basically a Christopher Nolan Batman movie. The standard route to take would just be to cast someone else in the role, keep a few players on the board, hop on the latest action movie trend, and hope that this would be one of the good ones. But if you want to go a different direction with this franchise, there's one more permutation out there that would be both familiar and refreshing, that would differentiate this from movies like Kingsman and Man from U.N.C.L.E., that would bring old and new fans on board and would open up very interesting storytelling possibilities. Which brings me to number 1 of my 7 ideas for the next Bond. Note the phrasing, heightened realism. This means that, no, we're not going to go Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy or Boyhood.
I think that's fucking funny.
We're not going to see James Bond file paperwork or deal with Soviet lawyers or all of the uninteresting things that real-life by-the-book espionage entails. No, not hyper-realism. Heightened realism. Cinematic realism. The kind that takes the franchise staples, like the car chases, the plane crashes, the fist fights, the set pieces, the stunts, the exotic locations, and everything else, and gives them the weight and believability that you can only achieve with the best of modern action filmmaking, using the tools and techniques we have available today. The kind that uses every tool at its disposal, like real sets, practical effects, invisible visual effects, to create a world that, as far as the human eye can tell, is visually indistinguishable from reality. Now, imagine that brand of filmmaking set against the backdrop of this culturally remarkable decade that is the 60s. It's something that we, for the most part, haven't seen before on the big screen. Certainly not from the Bond franchise. And certainly not from Man from U.N.C.L.E., a very good movie that had a radically different direction than the one I'm pitching.
See you two later.
Imagine all of the things that a glorious return to the Cold War era playground would give us, and seeing all of that in a way that we've never seen before. Think of all the ways that the Bond films of old would be transformed given this commitment to cinematic realism. Needless to say, combat would be vastly different. As much as these older films generally had more than serviceable fight choreography, it's hardly controversial to say that having characters who operate under a semblance of real-world military tactics would be a step forward, as opposed to characters who shoot from the hip at targets dozens of meters away, or who throw their victims around at the expense of a perfectly good stranglehold. Despite the fact that the legendary work of Academy Award-winning production designer Kenneth Adam is as iconic as the early Bond films that his work inhabited, imagine the degree to which a visionary like him would benefit from a filmmaking environment that isn't limited by the resources of his time. Picture the archetypal evil lair, the typeset in exotic locales, the type that was so pervasive in the early Bond films. Now picture that location designed by one of the many talented production designers of our day, like Nathan Crowley, built with the scale and visual flourish available today, augmented by photorealistic computer graphics, and shot in glorious 4K or 65mm by someone like Robert Richardson or Sean Bobbitt. Even more important than the return of the iconic factions that populated this era and the potential introduction of ones that we haven't seen before in this franchise is the fact that we would see them fully realized in ways that just weren't possible back then. Consider the depiction of the invasion of Normandy in two films that featured Oscar-nominated cinematography and art direction. The 1962 film The Longest Day and the 1998 film Saving Private Ryan. Add 18 more years, and that is the degree of creative and technical innovation that you are applying to the iconic catalog of allies, villains, and factions that the 60s era Bond had, like the Soviet Russians, the Mafia, ex-Nazis, communist revolutionaries, the CIA, Spectre, Smersh, corrupt industrial conglomerates, and the characters you can potentially have, like the Yakuza, the Viet Cong, Black September, the Irish Republican Army, Israeli Secret Service, and a whole lot more. A return to the 60s ropes in the return of everything that gives this franchise its distinctive aesthetic identity, the classic Bond elements that the Bond films of the past few decades have somewhat curtailed in varying degrees, like the exotic equipment and vehicles, the post-mortem one-liners,
Shocking.
the sexually suggestive names, the physically privileged henchmen, the megalomaniacal supervillains, and the elaborate architecture of their command centers, along with others. On top of bringing them back, we can take these things that make the Bond franchise unique and push them further with everything that the film industry has acquired in the 50 years that have gone by. In a few months, a precedent will be set regarding this approach. There will already be a franchise film out there that will be embracing the iconography of the older installments, creating a new story, and using the technology that we have today to fully realize the imagination of the older films. It's called Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So, Eon Productions, if you're listening, Rogue One the fuck up.
You see the gear lever here? Now, if you take the top off, you'll find a little red button. Whatever you do, don't touch it.
While I hesitate to say that the best Bond films have a science fiction element, the fact that a majority of these films do is undeniable. So much so that many fans regard it as an essential part of the franchise, and view its absence in the recent Bond films as one of their shortcomings.
A gun and a radio.
In the immortal words of Mr. Sunday movies,
Get some proper bloody gadgets, Craig, for God's sake.
and while this decision could be explained as an attempt to get closer to Ian Fleming's vision for the character and distinguish itself from the Brosnan outings, the approach that I find satisfying moving forward is not to remove these science fiction elements, but to interpret them in a way that's consistent with the direction that we're taking, which is heightened realism. How do we do that? Simple. We're going to derive an informal corollary from one of Arthur C. Clarke's 3 laws of prediction, specifically the third, which famously declared that, quote, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. In that case, any sufficiently advanced technology from a couple of decades in the future is indistinguishable from science fiction. Since we live 5 decades in the future from when the early Bond films were set, the line between science reality and science fantasy, as it was imagined in the 60s, has never been clearer than it is today with the benefit of hindsight. We know the type of technology that can exist in the near future of the 60s, and the type that can exist even today. For this reason, I propose that the artistic discipline that we're going to set regarding the science fiction element of the Bond franchise is this. Only use technology that can conceivably exist in the last 50 years, designed, of course, with the aesthetic of the 60s in mind. That way we can preserve the central conceit of these movies, which is that the upper echelons of the international superpowers and industrial enterprises have access to technology that's ahead of their time, while simultaneously eliminating the prospect of venturing into fantasy. Not only will this guide the selection and interpretation of the gadgets that we can retain from the past Bond films, but also the ones that we can and have yet to include. And we have 50 years worth of technology to choose from. So while we can't use the cigarette rocket launcher or the laser watch, an exploding pen is fair game. Many of the classic Bond gadgets do exist in the world today, like the homing beacon, wristwatches with Geiger counters, spy cameras, infrared rifle scopes, incendiary ammunition. Even the jetpack would work, provided that the engineering resembles this, but designed with a distinct visual aesthetic of the 60s. A crude 60s version of this prosthetic limb would be the perfect interpretation of Dr. No's robotic hands, for example. But there's a wealth of technology that the Bond franchise has yet to incorporate in its stories. Imagine the famous corner shot, designed with all of the cold, rugged beauty of a futurist 60s firearm, like the Heckler & Koch G11. The first successful bullpup first went in production in 1977, but in the heightened universe we're creating, perhaps a certain head of a certain global criminal enterprise has armed his best men with a colorful assortment of bullpup prototypes a decade earlier. While the Magpul FMG-9 was first created in 2008, perhaps Q Branch already developed a folding machine gun prototype in the 60s, maybe even a full-sized carbine version, issued one to James Bond for a specific mission, and didn't intend on mass production due to whatever financial reasons. We can have the 60s versions of things like the Tech Torch, a breaching tool that cuts through solid steel like butter using a 5,000 degree flame, the X-Stat, something that injects you with expanding hemostatic sponges to control bleeding, the Grem, a door-breaching grenade that you can launch with your rifle from 70 feet away, among a ton of other things that would have been considered squarely science fiction for someone who lived in the 60s. Colin Firth's wrist-mounted flamethrowers would have been perfect for the type of megalomaniacal supervillain that would be obsessed with the Roman fire god Vulcan and so forth. The shark pellet from Live and Let Die would never work that way in real life, but if you take the engineering concept of the Wasp tactical knife, a blade that will instantly disable your vital organs with a violent explosion of freezing compressed carbon dioxide, and apply that to a harpoon gun, then you have something that preserves the idea of the original through a far less comical execution.
Missed Mr. Bond. Did I?
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War.
Writer Warren Ellis sums up who Bond is quite nicely. Quote, James Bond is not Superman. He prevails because he is quite simply nastier and more determined to wreak utter bloody havoc than the next guy. In some ways, and I don't think Fleming was unaware of this, he is what Allen Ginsberg called bleak male energy, causing and taking immense damage in single-minded pursuit of what he wants. He is England's blunt instrument of international assault, the spiteful, vicious bastard of a faded empire that still wants the world to do as it's bloody well told.
Suppose that's something.
Unquote. A scarred, damaged human being with all of the flaws that more often than not go together with existing at that point in history, prejudiced in more ways than one, unquestioning of his role as a state-sponsored assassin, in contrast to someone like Jason Bourne, with a dangerous, internalized cold-heartedness that the job requires. Regarding how the Bond of the 60s treated women, it ranges from casual misogyny.
Felix, say hello to Dink.
Hi, Dink.
Dink, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
To sexual assault. On racial issues, Fleming wrote him as having the opinion that Koreans are, quote, lower than apes in the mammalian hierarchy. And let's not get started on how much Bond's bizarre indifference to having killed a person and the amount of mental effort he must be devoting to dehumanizing them in his mind.
One of my friends sits this one out. She's just dead.
Reminds me of Indonesian death squad leader Anwar Congo from The Act of Killing. You root for him because of the global threats he's staring down, but by all means, James Bond, as he was envisioned and accepted into pop culture, is a morally reprehensible human being. And that's exactly how we're going to portray him, flaws and all. Why do this? Daniel Craig left us with a Bond who can do this.
I'm stabilizing Ronson.
We don't have the time.
I have to stop the bleeding.
Leave him.
And this. Why not continue the trend of an increasingly progressive James Bond? Of course, you certainly can. But returning to the core of the character through the lens of modernity and 50 years of moral progress almost effortlessly elevates the material. Take for instance a scene like this, where we can clearly see the ethical position that the movie is taking by listening to the swelling orchestral music. If you shoot the same scene flat, without the implicit bias that the music cues us into, and have us judge the morality of this act based on the act itself and not how it's presented?
Now let's both play.
Then suddenly, the film becomes an invitation to confront the demons of our past eye to eye. It's what Bob Chipman calls the madmen approach. Quote, Don Draper was a fascinating anti-hero because of our awareness that his villainy was considered wholly normal, ideal even for his time. Unquote. There's a difference between a story starring a morally dated character and a story with dated moral positions. To take an example from the opposite end of the spectrum, a character with an unwavering resistance to moral compromise would in the past be held as the ideal, but in a story that follows that through to its logical conclusion, we get the chance to venture into uncharted narrative territory. Giving us the purest, most brutally honest representation of the character could be the shot in the arm that the franchise needs from a storytelling point of view. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we need to keep James Bond in a state of moral stasis, even though you could. This approach of a ruthless commitment to the original vision presents the opportunity to develop him as a character, regardless of the direction that that development will take him. Anthony Horowitz, author of the latest 60s-era Bond novel, Trigger Mortis, said, quote, I remain true to every one of Bond's things. He does smoke cigarettes. He smokes many cigarettes, but then what I do is I nudge him with a little reference to a newspaper article he happens to glance at, which just reminds him that these things will give him cancer. With women, he has this sort of patronizing carnal attitude, which is absolutely accurate to the Bond of the books. But then by creating very strong women, he is given quite a run for his money, and his attitudes are challenged. I also gave him a very outspoken gay friend who chides him and says, come on Bond, you're living in the 20th century now, not the Middle Ages. Unquote. But forget giving Bond a gay friend, you can do something much more interesting, like, for example, giving Bond a gay colleague, a 00 agent that Bond can't help but respect, whose main difference is the fact that he lives in a country that persecutes people like him. This is someone who knows that the war hero who, as Churchill said, made the single biggest contribution to the war effort in World War II, was rewarded by the British government with probation and chemical castration just because he was gay. For a hypothetical gay 00 agent in the 60s, this is a wound that would still sting. Answering the question of how James Bond would interact with someone who has that life experience is a blessing for screenwriters hungry for challenging material.
Funny game, right? Sorry, I should have introduced myself, seeing as we're related. Felix Leiter, a brother from Langley.
Felix Leiter, CIA agent and a recurring ally in the stories, isn't the household name that James Bond is, but he can be. And that's not because the character is particularly well written in the books and movies. Kingsley Amis, author of the popular James Bond dossier, notes that Leiter is, quote, such a non-entity in characterization, whose only role is to supply Bond with technical support in hardware and add muscle and money whenever needed, unquote. The movies took advantage of this blank slate of a character and took various liberties in adapting him, changing ages, origins, phenotypes, and most importantly, personality. In the history of the Bond franchise, he's been rugged, silly, cynical, optimistic, smooth,
Yeah, I spotted you at the airport.
crass,
Well, hello, 00.
All in.
No nonsense, all nonsense, overweight, athletic, CIA, DEA, you name it. The only thing constant about Felix Leiter is that he's good friends with James Bond. The frequent recasting and the inconsistent characterization has prevented the character from being truly memorable. But he can be. And it's not just because he can be James Bond with an American accent. It's because of what you can have when you take the permutation that hasn't been done yet, that the 60s setting affords you. Which is this. An African-American intelligence operative of the CIA at the height of the civil rights movement. An all-American counterpart of James Bond, shaped by the experiences of living as a black man through the racially turbulent decades of the 40s and 50s. Would he still resemble Jack Lord's cool, swaggering take on the character? Would he have some of Czech Linder's understated positivity? Jeffrey Wright's tranquil cynicism? You can go any direction, even new ones, and still painlessly end up with a character that's far more interesting than any single one of the past versions. Not only will this be a step forward in transforming this glorified plot device into a genuinely three-dimensional character, and potentially create memorable, fascinating interactions as a supporting character for Bond, but I think Felix Leiter imagined in this way is compelling enough to carry his own franchise. A recurring fantasy of Eon Productions, who tried and failed to get spin-offs made starring Halle Berry's Jinx and Michelle Yeoh's Wei Lin. On top of the character providing an interesting narrative counterpoint to James Bond, a film franchise starring this amalgamated version of Felix Leiter could provide the same to the Bond franchise itself. Perhaps a Felix Leiter story would star a protagonist that would be far less trusting of the government machine, less cavalier about collateral damage, and have adventures that focus on more internal threats. One idea that comes to mind is to pit Felix Leiter against the CIA's own fuck-ups, specifically the MK-Ultra program. And hey, wouldn't it be refreshing to have Bond be a minor character in someone else's movie for once? It worked for Spider-Man in Civil War and Batman in Suicide Squad. Maybe a reduced presence would make his appearance even more satisfying. Who knows? Needless to say, Felix Leiter needs to be introduced in the new Bond's first movie and lose his hand to a fucking shark in the second, like in the books. Leiter's prosthetic hooks haven't been in the movies even once. It's only appropriate that we have a look that we've never seen before to accompany a take on the character that's equally unprecedented. There's this popular fan theory out there that tries to bring all of the Bond films together on a single continuity by stating that James Bond is a code name that's passed on from one MI6 agent to the next, and that the James Bonds of Sean Connery, George Lazenby, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig all exist in the same universe as different people. There are many variations of this theory that try to plug the many holes that an idea like this creates. An example of such is one that says that the agents who take on the mantle are brainwashed into believing an artificial identity, which is just a way to try to get around the fact that both For Your Eyes Only and Skyfall disconfirmed all of this via tombstones. Making all of this work in the search for continuity within a franchise that hardly values continuity is a logistical nightmare, but I think there's something quite valuable to take away from this. While this has been in the zeitgeist since George Lazenby's fourth wall breaking in On Her Majesty's Secret Service,
this never happened to the other fella,
and David Niven's knowing winks in Casino Royale,
from now on, all remaining agents and trainees will be known as James Bond 007, including the girls.
Well, that'd be rather confusing.
more than ever in the age of the MCU, there's clearly a demand for a wider cinematic universe for James Bond, shared even by the franchise itself, considering the ill-advised creative decisions made in the last one. As you can see, it's difficult to do it in a way that feels earned. But it's possible. More than just laying the foundations for a Felix Leiter franchise, exploring the 8 other agents in the 00 section, and trying to get films off the ground based on the numerous interesting characters that we can create in this world, in the vein of Waylon, Francisco Scaramanga, Tiger Tanaka, the central question is about what you can do with James Bond himself. And the answer is this. Use the fact that 007 is a code name that can be passed on. Notice how I didn't say make it a code name that can be passed on, because it already is. There is precedent in the canon. 002 was killed during the events of The Man with a Golden Gun, but a replacement 002 appeared in the living daylights on a training exercise.
That's it, chum. You're out of it.
James Bond is 007, but 007 can be anybody. What doors does an open acknowledgement of the transmissible nature of the 007 designation open up? From a storytelling perspective, 2 007s on a single timeline. From a commercial perspective, 2 simultaneous Bond franchises. One fighting the battles of the Cold War, another fighting the battles of today. If I may, imagine a 007 played by Tom Hiddleston or Michael Fassbender fighting Blofeld and the Soviets in the 60s, and a 007 played by Idris Elba or Riz Ahmed fighting North Koreans and ISIS in today's world. When you already have a James Bond that's viciously accurate to the source material and in his natural habitat, that gives you free rein to reinvent and experiment without any reasonably justifiable charges of erasing the original character out of existence. The pipe dream of a Jane Bond franchise, complete with Bond boys named Ethan Bush or Richard Fitzwell, can exist in the shared universe. While I sense that most would prefer a new character for the modern era 007, if you would want to retain the James Bond name, you can pull something off that's directly from the books. James Bond, in the books, and I'm not kidding, is a father. His son is named James Suzuki Bond, his son to Kissy Suzuki from You Only Live Twice. That's canon. So if you wanted to, the modern era Bond could conceivably retain the name, be a son or daughter, and still make sense within the universe. Much like how Samuel Jackson's Shaft is actually the original Shaft's nephew. Following 2 007s in the same timeline, separated by 50 years, also gives you the chance to see a version of Bond that we've never seen. An old one. Well, an older one. What is he like in his 80s? Is he retired? Is he training the next batch of 00s? Has he been promoted to head of MI6 as M? Has he gone mad? What if he's evil now and the 007 of the modern era has been tasked to take him down? What would that be like? So, if you have a James Herbert Bond in the 60s, by the way, that name is canon, that's his full name in the books, and he hates it, and a James Marshall Bond, or whatever better name you can think up, in the 2020s, Felix Leiter, the rest of the 00s, maybe even ones that we've seen before, like Alec Trevelyan, maybe even a Jane Bond as one of those 00s, and all of the colorful characters that you can populate this world with, then you have everything you need to succeed where Spectre failed, which is a cinematic universe that feels earned. And making use of the fact that 007 is a title that can be passed on is the first step to doing that.
Who is this?
There's no need for an origin story again, especially since his origin story has just been done 3 movies ago. Setting Casino Royale in the 60s does very little to necessitate a remake. Just drop us off in the middle of a mission. Casino Royale was a coming-of-age story. Quantum of Solace was a revenge story. Skyfall was a defending your mom from revenge story. Spectre was a, this time, it's personal story. And all of these movies had James Bond going rogue. We've never seen Daniel Craig's Bond in a movie centered around an impersonal, self-contained mission outside of the video games. which means it's the best time to go back to that convention. Even the excellent Mission Impossible franchise suffers from this as well. If every movie has a disavowed Ethan Hunt going rogue, then being disavowed and going rogue doesn't feel like the departure from convention that it's supposed to feel like. And so it is with Bond having personal stakes. You need a couple of Bond movies where he's just being a professional doing his day job. Otherwise, having him face a demon from the past feels like the usual state of affairs, when it shouldn't be. If we're going to do a 60s Bond, it has to be a couple of new, self-contained mission movies, potentially a couple of reimagined versions of the earlier movies, then maybe a new story that's about his past. In addition, perhaps we can do a correctly arranged Blofeld trilogy. That's Thunderball, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, You Only Live Twice, at the end of this new Bond actor's tenure as a proper send-off. This is a franchise that stars a guy who kills a lot of people and has a lot of sex. Even as it is right now, with both of those elements toned down, this isn't the type of movie that kids should be watching anyway. So, how about forgetting the kids entirely and fully committing to a more complete vision for James Bond? Maybe adding in a little more graphic violence and nudity would really bring home the nature of his job, the type of person that he is, and the type of people that he's up against in a way that we largely haven't seen before. While historically the weakest James Bond film was the only R-rated one, it's not like these films can't succeed. Despite their R ratings, properties like Game of Thrones, Deadpool, and Kingsman have been commercial successes. That's not because of any single component, especially not just because they have an R rating. It's because, as director James Gunn put it, they're original, damn good, made with love by the filmmakers, not afraid to take risks, and most importantly, are giving you something that you don't already have.
James Bond is his own sex symbol. If the women starring the roles are complaining about, well, why do we have to take our clothes off? Bond should take his clothes off too. And we're not talking about pornographic scenes, just sexier, just spice it up. I mean, it's the perfect series to do it with. The violence, a little more grittier, hardcore, in your face. Some profanities, never been in the series, more than, I think, a couple of shits or something. You know, I think under extreme stress, you know, Bond would probably tell someone to go fuck themselves. There's a lot of potential for doing this, and I'll continue to dream about it.
I've got a little itch. Down there. Would you mind?
Let's bring back the sharks. Both animatronic sharks and CGI sharks have never looked as realistic as they are today. Just a big shark would be fine, but if you want to have that classic James Bond visual appeal, then I suggest we put a prosthetic flipper in there. I think that's a perfectly acceptable level of ridiculousness. Let's cast James Cosmo or somebody like him as the quartermaster. Obviously he won't be comic relief anymore because we'll be doing something that's closer to Fleming's vision for the character, which is an ex-military firearms expert. If you wanted, you can preserve the humor, but I think you'd have to tone down the slapstick and rely on the back and forth banter. Let's eventually have a remake of The Man with a Golden Gun, but done the way the filmmakers wanted to do it, but couldn't, which is setting it in Cambodia. Take away the third nipples, take away the comedy, and just have it be the story of two of the world's best assassins trying to kill each other, set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Also, the book starts in such an extraordinary way that we'd be stupid not to include that. Let's bring back opening credits that are completely made with practical effects. I know it's just going to make the job harder, but I think this will help further set this apart from the other films, feel much more appropriate for the period setting, and push the envelope for this type of sequence. We have way more tools today than a simple projector. Let's have a scene where James Bond has to escape a hippie commune full of cult members. a Charles Manson type character has the potential to be a very memorable Bond henchman. Let's have a scene where Commander Bond does some actual commanding. You know, stealth mission, tactical gear, barking orders at subordinates, coordinating an attack, wearing a beret. The closest we have to a scene like this is the opening from The Living Daylights, but that's just a training exercise that went wrong. Let's see that again, but for real. Maybe even leading a team in the company of another 00. Speaking of which, there's this great James Bond fan film on YouTube called In Service of Nothing, produced by Adi Shankar. That's about how a loss of purpose in the modern world would affect Sean Connery's aging James Bond. And it's one of the best setups for a Bond villain that there is. Since we're able to have 2 Bond franchises existing in one timeline, we can establish a 00 character in the 60s era that suffers from the same flaws that Bond suffers from, take the plot of that fan film, and make that character a villain for the modern era Bond. The archetypal agent-on-agent versus movie, but this time pitting the character that he was and the character that he can be. I think a theme like that, especially considering the cultural conversation outside of the movies, would be ripe for exploration. Thank you for watching the video. If you like my ideas or agree with them, and you want these ideas to gain traction and maybe help their chances in making their way to the big screen, please share this video on social media with your friends. If you think this video is worth something, or if you want to support me in making more videos like this, please consider making a donation to the PayPal link below. Literally any amount would be of so much help. I could really use some extra money right now. If you do donate to this film-loving third world country brown boy, your name would be in the end credits of the next video as a token of appreciation. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit links below. Thank you.